All right, everything looks good. So Neeraj, I went ahead and moved the IstioCon conversation up first. Oftentimes when I run a slide deck, questions can eat up the rest of the meeting, and I want to make sure we get to this. So we had IstioCon on September 25th and 26th. I think I saw pretty much everybody who's in the room at the moment at the conference one way or the other, whether asking questions or presenting, some behind the scenes support. So thank you everyone for your involvement. I have a few numbers that I can share about attendance. I had a few numbers. Where did they go? We had an average of 65 to 75 people watching each event live, or each talk live. And we had about 200 unique people check in over the course of the 2 days. So that was the size of our audience. Somewhere I have the registration number, but I'm having trouble finding it. I believe it was a bit under 1,000 registered. It's pretty normal to have about 25% of the people who register for this sort of thing attend, particularly when no money has traded hands. It was a free conference, so there's fairly little commitment when you register. Wanted to check in with everyone in the room. How did everyone here feel it went? Any notes we ought to take for next year's IstioCon as we go about building this?
I think steering kind of had discussion around this. We decided we're not going to do any virtual conference. It will be colo events related to KubeCon or Open Source Summit, whichever CNCF approve us to do. Virtual seems not a good use of our time, given people are tired of virtual conference and also the low attendance of IstioCon this year.
Yeah. Lynn, I know we had talked about having a standalone conference. Do you know if that's still on the table?
I don't believe we apply for that because that requires like 4 or 5 sponsors, big sponsors, which we've been struggling to get colo sponsors for Istio Day. I don't think Istio would meet requirements for that.
Makes sense.
Justin, correct me if I said anything wrong regarding IstioCon.
Sorry, I just joined. I didn't hear any of it.
So Mitch was asking a standalone physical IstioCon event. I don't believe we're planning for that. I think one of the reasons was the sponsor requirements.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think then the things, since we're now able to do days around KubeCon, I think the current thinking was that was probably the best way to do it.
I think it makes sense, right? KubeCon has a core mass momentum already, and since Istio is under CNCF now, having a full day co-located, you probably get more eyeballs and easier to manage for logistics compared to a separate standalone physical event just run by the steering committee and us.
Yeah, makes sense. Anyone else have thoughts to share on IstioCon this year? All right. Well, thanks everyone for the time you put in reviewing talks, giving talks, and dealing with some extremely complicated technical issues from time to time. It was appreciated. I have the only item on the agenda, and I'm also driving the meeting. Is there anything else people want to talk about before we get to that? Any other items?
I have just a quick question. I think that the meeting invitation may have the wrong link still for the meet.
Okay, so it does if you are using the old calendar. This week we moved to a new calendar. So for instance, if in the past you copied events from the Istio workgroup calendar onto your calendar, you have the wrong link. However, I believe John went through and edited all those meetings to title them obsolete. But if you copy them into your calendar, you don't get those updates.
I think I have the right one. I mean, it's the right color for it. So
if it was right last month, it's wrong this month, if that makes sense.
Okay.
That has all changed. I can point you, actually, I've got this other thing up. If someone, oh, thank you, Keith. So there's the link to our new calendar.
Okay.
With all of the new links. And Justin, the main reason for this was that non-Googlers could not really work with the old calendar. We didn't have
Right.
write access to it. We couldn't join meetings without permission, and we could not record many, like this, the TOC meeting, I don't think we've recorded in 4 or 5 months because we lost, even Googlers lost permission to that one.
Right. Okay. Yeah. No, it was more just, it was, yeah, I don't see the old one being labeled old, but that's fine. It looks good
Okay.
as long as it's kind of being publicized. Because I know there were a couple other people that were also on the previous meeting. Like,
Yeah.
All right.
There were.
Thank you.
Does someone need to join that old meeting and let everyone know to move?
Yeah, no, I think that we figured it out.
Okay, excellent. Sorry about that.
Thanks. Sorry, we missed it.
Sadly, there is no way to permanently end a Google Meet so that people can't join. Once the link is out there, that meeting room is open forever.
I was going to say, as long as a Googler didn't join, you couldn't get in, right? With the old links.
Right, but I did join, and then
Yeah.
I let people in.
So yeah, so we probably should have somebody from Google maybe hit the meetings for a week or two just to do that, unless they will just know at some point to go here. The other comment for you, Mitch, was I think John mentioned it at one of the meetings last week. The enhancement subgroup, did we get them moved over that meeting?
We have not. I can do that this morning. Whitney, that happens next week, right?
Yeah, it should be next week.
Okay. I will get that copied over and get you a new link for the note stock and all of that stuff.
Okay, and I see I updated my calendar, and it does look like the Istio working group meeting is labeled obsolete, but the TOC meeting, at least on my calendar, is not.
Okay.
So it looks
Gotcha.
like maybe I'll ping John and then see maybe if we can just make sure we get them all tagged.
He's on vacation at the moment, but yeah.
Right. Great. Thank you.
No worries. Sorry for the confusion. There's no clearly easy way to transition from one Google Workspace to another. All right. Well, so I've got a very short deck here to share with everyone this morning. One of the things that we've been struggling to collect is feedback on Ambient. We've been in alpha for nearly 6 months now, and we've not had any users publicly share their experience or join any of our community meetings to talk about their thoughts using Ambient. And so I've been sort of troubleshooting ways to go about this, and I reached out to a friend who suggested that Twitter might be the way to contact our users. Something less formal. You know, what we've been asking is, excuse me, what we've been asking is a way for users to join a big panel where they're up in front of a lot of people and we're going to ask them questions, and it feels very official and formal, like it would take a lot of investment ahead of time. Understandable that users might be a bit hesitant to do that. Hot takes are a bit more what we're looking for on Twitter. And so that is what we asked for. I hosted last Monday an event called Hot Takes Ambient Backwards Compatibility. I was joined by Kelsey Hightower, who of course heavily influenced attendance and visibility numbers. My tweet got 100 views. His tweet got 45,000. But that meant that we were able to get this kind of a good amount of visibility and bring a lot of engagement. We had 240 live attendees for an hour of the event. Since then, it's been replayed a little over 1,249 times. Got the number of impressions. I've also had some follow-up meetings. I posted a calendar at the end of the meeting and said, hey, like, grab time with me if you'd like to one-on-one really walk through your use case and explain why or what you're thinking about Ambient in relation to your particular use case. And so I did have 2 of those, and those allowed me to really dive deep with individual users. The target for this was very much existing users. We did have one user who spoke up and mentioned that they're considering using Istio and are not clear whether they should be adopting Ambient or adopting Sidecar at the moment. But other than that, the feedback seemed to all come from existing users of Sidecar mode in Istio. So we're really talking about a lot about compatibility between the two systems, as you'll see. I'm just going to walk you through a couple of sections that have like key learnings. The two areas that I learned about were the implications of platform engineering for Ambient, a little bit more about understanding how our users think about service cost for services and what that means for Ambient, and then a few concluding thoughts. If you're not familiar with the concept of platform engineering, this is the idea that an internal team at a company that used to be effectively IT. It used to be you had network engineers and you might have a few other like a database administrator in IT at the company, and they would make things available to application developers. But with all of the toolings that have come through sort of the Kubernetes revolution, platform engineering has become this new pattern where instead of just applying a network and maybe a database and a few other things, a web server, you can provide a comprehensive platform for the developers at your team that is custom to the needs of your company. If you're a bank, you might have high needs for data exfiltration prevention, or compliance testing, etc. If you're a startup on an e-commerce site, those are not going to be concerns. So every company's platform looks a little bit different. And platform engineering is something we've been recommending in the Istio community for adopters of Istio since before it was really called that. I think the first time I heard about it was in 2019 when Carl Stoney, one of the people who responded on Twitter from AutoTrader, joined the Kubernetes podcast to talk about how AutoTrader had implemented Google. And what they had really done was abstracted Istio from their developers. And that's a pattern we've encouraged users to follow, that every application developer in your company shouldn't necessarily know how to use Istio. Instead, it should be your platform team who knows how to use it. And they expose templates, patterns, best practices for those developers to take advantage of. So we got a little bit of feedback related to platform engineering. And it's interesting because we focused so much on operational pain reduction with Ambient, and I think we've achieved a great deal of operational pain reduction. I expected to hear that platform engineers would be thrilled with this operational pain reduction. But the truth is, or at least what I found on this event, is that platform engineers have already sunk in the time to reduce operational pain in the sidecar model. I spoke to two different developers here on the screen, each of whom has written an operator that already goes through and monitors what sidecars are running and their relationship to the control plane, and evicts pod at a very regulated rate in order to automatically upgrade Istio. There's no need to do pod restarts. You upgrade the control plane, and over time, I think they said over about 4 hours a cluster on average, the data plane is automatically upgraded with rollbacks already built into their platform. So they're looking at this from the perspective of, if I've already built all those features, I already have effectively a declarative upgrade path, a safe rollback path. I'm already not worried about Istio upgrades. I don't spend that much time rolling them out because I've sunk months, if not years, into developing this platform to route around the pain we're solving. What's the value in them for moving to a different solution for the same problem? Re-engineering your platform is very expensive, one of the most expensive things a platform engineering team can do, and they are not really anxious to do that unless we can show clear value that they were unable to provide with their platform. So that was some interesting feedback that I did not expect along the way. And I'm going to pause there in case people have questions around the platform engineering angle.
So Mitch, just in terms of audience selectivity, right? Like, because I want to be careful to make sure that we're not over pivoting on any one piece of feedback. Like, we expect people with sunk cost, right, to be resistant to make changes.
Exactly.
Right? Like, if I installed Oracle 9i 7 years ago and it's still doing the job that it used to do, I have very low motivation to change it. Like, that's expected, right? Like, I want minimal disruption, right, until there's some, right, event cliff that I have to get over that forces me to go through a transition, right? And we've seen that in enterprise. I mean, that's endemic in enterprise. That's baked in, right? Like,
Yeah.
Oracle AI is still running in production in lots and lots of places, right? Despite the fact that it's not been patched in probably a decade. So I just want to make sure, right, in terms of audience selectivity, right? Obviously, these are folks who have been running Istio in production quite happily. Like, we all know Carl. We're all grateful to Carl and his contributions over the years. So in terms of the audience, was it Istio practitioners, or was it, right, because you mentioned there was one person who was interested in doing Istio and bringing it to maybe a platform.
Istio practitioners. Particularly, I mean, we tweeted it out using the Istio tag and the Istio mesh ID. Those are predominantly going to capture people who are following those tags and IDs on Twitter or handle, which is typically not going to be someone who's thinking about adopting service mesh over the next 6 months, but rather someone who's been following Istio for some time, probably because they've already gone through adoption or because they like controversy on Twitter. So this is our legacy users is not the term I want to use. These are our existing user base is what I was going after. And you're right, it's a very particular audience. I am not proposing any particular pivot to the project with this presentation. I'm sharing some surprising things I've learned. We'll get to the conclusion tab, and most of my conclusion is I can see clear value for new users of Istio. The value for existing users is going to be a little bit harder to show. I don't know if that means we need to pivot. If it does, I don't know what pivot we would take, but it helps in understanding how we position the product and how we steer over time.
Yeah, I mean, like we have Darren Shepherd on Twitter saying, all I want is ambient without all the other Istio stuff, right? Like, yeah. So we know we have a bimodal audience, right?
Yes.
Yeah,
I guess I did.
I think overall, the benefits of Istio, of ambient are in multiple streams, right? So it just depends if your use cases and your deployment topology will hit any of those benefits or not, right? So customers who have spent the time operationalizing and automating the platform, for them, it's a burden to move and operationalize something else. And the carrot there has to be significantly large, right? So if their deployment topology and use cases doesn't need spinning up as many waypoints as the sidecars would have spun up, then they can advocate for a cost reduction. And then they get their management and the higher ups to buy in, right? But if the only thing they will say is, hey, we have to now move to a new model of Istio, and I can't tell you what benefit it is, but give me 3 months of work, right? Nobody will advocate for it. Neither the person doing the work nor the person higher up. I think Carl is in that category. Having known Carl for a long time and knowing how they do things, finally he is.
Yep. Keith?
Yeah, my feedback's probably more appropriate for steering, but since the steering meeting is closed, I'll bring it here since we're talking about it. I think when it comes, everything that Mitch you're saying that you've gathered from these sessions and kind of what has already been discussed, I think it points to a need for us as the implementers of ambience to kind of rethink our positioning and our benchmarks, not necessarily in a direct technical sense, but there have been several times where you're working on ambient. I've heard several folks say, well, at least it's better than sidecars. We're still providing a net improvement over sidecars, but sidecars aren't our competition. Regular Kubernetes CNIs are our competition. We need to prove to non-mesh users why they should go and adopt ambient, why they should, to quote Louis, you mentioned Darren Shepherd, to quote Darren, why I need to take the risk on Istio and all of the complexity of Istio. Why do I need to take on that risk as a platform team? What benefits are you going to give me over my node encryption, over my platform provided VNet encryption? How is this making my life better? And I don't think that's the story that we've been telling with ambient, looking at a lot of our public blogs and articles and even some of the talks that we're giving. I've talked to users, and they're like, "Okay, this seems promising. Okay, is it going to be slimmer and faster than Linkerd? Is it going to provide me is it going to be as easy to use as my CNI?" And so I think that what's being said here is at least making me think, okay, maybe we need to, again, not suggesting any major pivot as far as a technology perspective, but from a design product perspective, I think the positioning and the selling of ambient, as far as how we, who our target users is, that might need to have a little bit of an adjustment, at least for me personally.
Thanks, Keith. Lynn?
Yeah, I think, Keith, you are definitely right on. From the beginning, my impression, at least my understanding, is ambient is not target to Istio existing user who are happily using Istio, which Carl, I think, is. Ambient is really designed to, over the past 5-6 years, right? A lot of people look at Istio, but they walked away from us, right? They walk away from us because, they didn't want to handle sidecar, right? There was so much excitement around Cilium Surface Mesh when they first launched this thing without sidecar, right? So Ambient is really targeting these type of user who look at Istio, they want to use some of the mesh capability, right? But they had to walk away because they were like, oh, I don't have the energy or resource to pay for the complexity of Istio. So yeah, back to your point, I think we should emphasize on that and target, those user, right, to be able to reach the goal of ambient, right? Because right now we're probably 5% of Kubernetes users using service mesh, and mostly because it's so hard. It's not ambient, so people doesn't want to pay the operation cost or learning cost or whatever complexity come with it.
Lynn, one of the things that Carl mentioned in my chat with him was he said, I can totally see how other users should not have to spend a year building a system to manage Istio because of ambient. It should be easy to manage for them, and I think that's great for them. It's just not great for me because I've already built mine. So I think what you said there is spot on.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's like we are trying to broaden our market, right? That's breadth and depth, and ambient is definitely a breadth play to talk about the marketing and salesperson.
So just a slight side discussion then, is that part of the reason we're finding it hard to get feedback is because we keep talking about feedback from existing users, but if existing users aren't necessarily where we're focused, but new people.
I think, the idea that we were looking for feedback in a staging environment, particularly in a setting where it was a real world use case, something more than book info, but also not production. That slice, I'm not sure exists for new Istio users.
Right.
They don't have a use case today. Like they could just slap it onto their cluster and see what breaks, but they're not using existing mesh features. So they're really not exercising ambient today. In order to provide that kind of feedback, they have to go through all of the work of actually adopting and leveraging mesh features before they can really provide feedback on what they think of it.
We also have the alpha chicken and egg problem, right?
Yeah, I was just going to say that, right? That's the real problem here. And that has happened with every product which actually has a functioning GA. And that's what we are seeing, right?
Yeah. One, particularly, we're asking them, like, if it's alpha, we're saying, please adopt this in staging, go through all the work of, again, onboarding is not the problem. Onboarding is easy. Using, designing your HTTP routes in a way that makes sense, and your auth policy, and setting up dashboards to collect telemetry. Go through all of that pain. And then, by the way, it may move to beta in a different shape. So the investment that you made for just your staging environment may never pay off in production.
And we are in the other side of the hype cycle of service meshes, remember, right? We're not in the early phase where everything and every announcement that we make, people are latching on because those early adopters are like Carl, whose investments are now paying off. And now the early majority who comes in, they by definition of the hype cycle, they don't like to take on alpha level projects.
I've got an unpopular question. What does this mean for backwards compatibility? It sounds like a lot of the feedback that we're hearing is that we're talking net new users. In my mind, I'm imagining the new contributor track at KubeCon, right? These are the people that we are trying to convince to use Ambient. If we're struggling to get people to use, to find that slice of people with usage in a staging environment that's not production, if we're struggling to, trying to keep things, we've been putting a lot of emphasis towards interop, and this is a much bigger conversation now. I don't think we're gonna completely solve in this meeting, but I think it's worth asking the question of how much is backwards compatibility with sidecars really buying us today? To go back to Darren, he's just one example, but I wonder how many other users out there would just want the ambient. They just want the mesh transport. They just want the L4 auth policy. For now, anyway, users always, they say they just want one thing, and then like 2 years later, they want a bunch of other stuff. But, maybe we can potentially create better abstractions, undo some things, optimize for that new use case. And if we break some eggs of compatibility along the way, maybe we still have brought in the market. Again, much pure conversation. But I think it's worth asking and discussing.
I think it's a fair question, Keith. We're always going to get blowback either side of that question, or it's going to have a cost. Our hope with Ambient is we would get an existing Istio user to make the transition and talk about it in glowing terms. And the assumption was that would be relatively easy compared to their initial Istio investment because we didn't break every API effectively. Right. So let's take Carl as an example, right? If he didn't have all this automation and the cost benefits were motivating to him, the hope was that we could get a user like him to try it, see the benefit, and then be vocal about it, because Carl was a vocal user in public. Maybe that's not playing out, but we want to be careful with the latent audience as well. So breaking backwards compatibility, or almost forking, right? Is almost kind of what we're talking about, like a logical fork in capability, which we still have, right? Like, Ambient is not 100% backward compatible with Sidecar because of a few things. We think that's not necessarily material to people, but so it's a hedge, right? I mean, we could have built Ambient as a whole new product or project. We decided not to do that. And would it save? So I guess there's a question now, Keith, about sunk cost. Like, would it actually save us anything versus what we've already done in terms of backward compatibility? And what would we gain or lose if we did or didn't do it?
So it's a little bit more, right, Louis? It's not just about the sunk cost, it's also about whether the UX that we actually want. When we think about the ambient architecture, are the new users getting the correct user experience because of the backward compatibility we have to preserve for the existing APIs? I think that for me is more important. Like, sunk cost is sunk cost, right? We have to do it one way or the other.
Right. That's the hedge, right? Like, we're trying to find some middle ground between the existing Istio user and new user. We put a lot of work into making the UX better for the existing Istio user over the last 5 years, but that's the hedge.
Yeah. I mean, we're talking about a 2.0 product. Basically, if we go the route where we say, okay, Ambient is the best Istio for the new users, for existing users, you're kind of stuck with sidecars, and then we give a migration path which is more onerous for the user, right? If they can't interoperate, then probably they spin up new clusters and migrate, which I think eventually many customers might do, to be honest. Like when I think of critical infrastructure that I'm upgrading and I'm going over a barrier of major changes, I will be too hesitant to just do them all in one cluster. I don't know how others think of it. Right? Like, so
So
I
is this a marketing problem or a product problem?
I think it's both.
it's right now both. I think we're trying to understand if we need to separate it out. Right.
I didn't capture the feedback in this deck, but we did hear a little bit on this topic during the chat. I heard from one user in particular who expressed that they are incapable of running a second cluster in production. Sounded like a sort of edge environment where it was not possible to get 2 clusters going. They were using all their compute on one cluster. And they were interested in a single cluster migration story from Sidecar to Ambient, in making sure that that was possible. That was one comment from one user. That was the only time I heard on that topic. The other sort of relevant thing is I heard from Carl and Josh and I think 2 others about their concerns that as developers, we're so excited about Ambient that we stopped giving any love to the sidecar, so to speak. That all the new features land in Ambient mode and not sidecar mode, and it effectively becomes deprecated over time, but like a soft deprecation where we never actually decide to deprecate it. They're worried about that. And I even heard one of them, I think it was Carl, gave feedback like, I'd rather have a hard deprecation strategy, saying like, sidecar is going away and you have to move by this date, then watch it slowly die on the vine due to lack of interest.
I mean, that's the other concern. So, go ahead, Lou.
No, it's perfectly fair comment.
Yeah, I mean that's the other concern with sidecars, because since I've been involved with Ambient, the refrain has been sidecars aren't going away. We're specifically not addressing certain use cases, consumer routing being, client routing, client policy being one of the main ones. You're specifically not addressing this because we can do it in sidecars. That's kind of been part of the design philosophy as we've made certain decisions to this point. So I think of it less as a V1, V2, and really as a bimodal, ideally. All right, none of this is taking into account staffing of the community or anything like that. That's a whole separate, I think, conversation. But where we are today, what I see as one individual is that we effectively have 2 different projects for 2 different segments of the population. If you have an existing platform engineering team that's staffed to say 20, 25, 30 engineers, then sidecars and all of that complexity and the ability to create a platform around it, then you're going to be able to gravitate towards that and implement that in a way that Carl has or any other one of these companies. If you are a startup or an SMB and you haven't yet, if you haven't staffed your ops team, your platform team to be able to handle those sorts of things, sidecars are crazy intimidating. And, something like Ambient is extremely attractive because it allows things to just happen in the background. You can go to Solo or Google or Microsoft or whoever to handle the upgrades and the compute provided by the platform. And that all just goes away. Like that's the value add for that segment of the population. And I think both are we've seen, I think, that both are very valid segments of the cloud native population, depending on where you are on your cloud native journey, as well as your stage, what you're investing in as a company. The question is for Istio, are we able to, or not even are able to, but do we feel like it's Istio's capability to support both of those segments and are willing to pay the cost for that?
They're both valid users, right? So I think the only question is, how can we keep the cost under control, right? If at some point, right, there's clear market signal say there's 10 times more ambient users than sidecar users. What are the types of decision structures you want to use to say, hey, we're going to deprecate a use case, right? Which is what Carl would want to know, right? And how do we go about making that decision as a community? Like whenever you do that, you're going to give somebody pain, right? Whether as an open source project or as an ISV, right? And so I don't anticipate us making that decision anytime soon, but we may. What we should be thinking about in the interim is how can we keep the pain of that under control? Like there was a good conversation in the working group meeting on Wednesday about sandwiching sidecars, right? Which allows us to change some of the complexity and maintenance dynamics of sidecars, while still beginning to leverage some of the underlying capabilities of ambient in a way that makes conceptual sense, just the way that we were able to layer waypoints with zTunnel. And that's probably going to be worth pursuing, because it yields some of those, right? Like there's not too much we can do on the operation side for sidecars, right? Beyond what we've already done or what we have to wait for Kubernetes to do for us. And we can't rely on Kubernetes for everything because there's lots of other use cases, right? Where we still have plenty of VMs out there that we want to address. So I think our primary focus in the medium term is how do we keep our operational and maintenance costs under control so that we have a runway to make this decision, right? Because if they run out of control, we're going to be forced to make it in ways that we don't like. And we just don't have enough people doing enough work to be able to handle all of this, and being forced to make decisions is not what you want to do.
So I don't have any answers to these questions. My goal is really just to start some thought-provoking conversation and maybe give us clarity on what our users are thinking. I will say my key learning was not even specific to ambient. This slide for me was about learning that any improvements we make to operations in Istio, any at all, if they require major changes to existing platforms, they're going to have slow uptake. They'll have value for new users who have not yet built their platforms, but they won't have substantial value early on for companies that have already built those platforms, because no matter how good the operational improvement is, modifying your platform is painful.
And in the context of that, like our oscillation between operator, Helm, and other installation forms has probably done more damage on this front than anything else over the course of the last 3 and 4 years.
Yeah, I agree. I was going to also say, if you look at the trajectory of issues filed by someone like Carl from Arbitrator, like it has significantly declined in the last 6 to 9 months to a year. I remember almost talking to him like every week or every 2 weeks on certain things. I'm sure the Google folks were doing the same, right? I think that is telling me also that the sidecar in terms of stability, the sidecar features in terms of maturity is already there. So unless we do some significant damage there to destabilize us, we have got ourselves a decent runway right now to experiment and invest in the ambient space, see how the adoption is, and then come to a decision point whether everyone will be like, okay, this migration path is doable, the features are there, and more of the folks like Carl who are owning platform strategy can budget that migration. So for me, the key thing also is not to destabilize the sidecar core, because that's going to be the most damaging thing for us. Because that way we just end up losing our core users who have been, on this journey for the past 5 years, who have done all the hard work with Istio when we have changed, God only knows so many things, right? So I don't know, Louis, if that is factored in, and if maybe just our tests being reliable is good enough at this point.
Yeah, I mean, we have crushed the coal of the operational experience into a functional diamond over the years, or the platform teams have learned how to paper over our cracks.
We've met in the middle.
One way or the other, right? People have reached some form of homeostasis, right?
Yeah.
So this is
Um,
on operational.
Either way, we have a runway because of that, though, Neeraj. Like that point is well.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
I do want to talk about a separate topic from operational pain because the second selling point for Istio Ambient has been improved resource utilization, effectively lowering how much your spend is on compute and memory, etc. So, and maybe this is just the way I've been thinking about it, but I know that, we did a little bit of research early on about the cardinality of pods to a service. How many pods tend to make up a service? Of course, there's a ton of variety, but we found, I think, like 3 to 5 was about the sweet spot, that a lot of customers use 3 to 5 pods to populate a given service. And so we said, well, if that service is using HTTP, they can use one waypoint in order to fulfill all the traffic needs for their service. So they'll have a 3 to 5x gain in compute, which is great. Well, the difficulty is that we were not considering the cost of zone egress fees. I chalk this up to the fact that I've never paid my own cloud bill. I worked at Google and Uncle Sundar paid for everything pretty transparently. And now even at Aviatrix, I really don't see my own bills. But if you have a client and a service that have scaled across zones and are handling traffic within those zones, the way that Istio locality load balancing will allow for, and then you scale up only a single waypoint to manage that service, you will begin routing traffic across zones twice in order to serve any zone that the waypoint doesn't exist in. The way that Josh described those fees is that they are an order of magnitude more significant than the cost of running a sidecar in every zone or a waypoint in every zone. So if you see a waypoint per zone instead of one waypoint.
So I think we are actually keenly aware of this issue, Mitch.
Okay.
Right, so your example is talking about a multi-zone cluster.
Yes. Not multi-zone from the perspective of the API server. Multi-zone from the perspective of the node pool.
Yes, which is the only thing that matters. Yes, we are keenly aware of this problem. Right. When I ask customers about load balancing, what do you care most about for load balancing? Latency, availability, or cost control? The answer is invariably for number one, cost control. The other two are second and third in random orders. We just haven't gotten around to giving people recommendations about this yet, but we are very keenly aware of this, both for Z-tunnel and for Waypoint.
Yeah.
We just haven't written the production recommendations yet. So it's true, right? If you run as multi-zone cluster, you should have one waypoint per zone. Now that also speaks to the fact, right? If you have multi-zone clusters, right? You made the decision, right, effectively to have different availability zones within a single Kubernetes cluster. And so your pod replica counts are probably going to be higher within that namespace as a result. Because if you run one pod per zone, right, one zone, right, that's pretty unusual to do that, right? You'll run 3 pods per zone to get some redundancy in the zone. And maybe not. This is also the reason, effectively, why I think most of the time users will want waypoint per namespace, not waypoint per service account, to get greater aggregation density. Right? With like, there's a trade-off between trust and delegation in that model, but right, still on average, like this is an atypical case. Like one pod per zone in a 3-zone cluster. Yes. Somebody will do that in a test. People probably won't do that in production.
Well, this was the production story from both Josh and Carl's experience.
So they were running single pod per zone.
Yes, on average, not across all their services, but their average cardinality. Let's see, Carl's average cardinality was 4.2 across 3 availability zones. And Josh's cardinality was lower.
That was per service. What was it per namespace?
Pods per service, and a namespace contains only one service. A service is a namespace.
Yeah. So this is fairly common. And the reason is from their HA requirements, right? They all start with multi-zonal pods for a service. That's just a requirement coming down for the compliance or whatever requirements they have, right? They actually don't know the load characteristics that well to understand in which zone they should ramp up the pods, right? And whenever the burst happens, the HPA just takes care of it. So they don't really feel that pain. That's what I've seen. Even some of the customers I've worked with, it's very common. They will stamp it out at the minimum level to make sure they have HA. And then at some later point, they'll try to understand the traffic patterns to optimize for number of replicas in one particular zone. But very rarely people get to it, Louis, just because it's a second order concern.
I mean, the other thing I would say is even if they had waypoint per zone, it's still actually cheaper. Right? That's the other thing to remember here, Mitch.
No, it depends how you're
Are you-
aggregating waypoints. I agree. It just
No. This is example in the example. Let's say you're trading 4 sidecars or 2 waypoints and 2 Z tunnels. We know that the memory footprint is lower. Still,
Right.
even in the degenerate case, right, where you have to have 1 waypoint per pod.
How does that work?
Well, the producer side waypoint has less configuration on average than the client side waypoint, right? So you have to look at the sets, right? Every sidecar is both a producer and a consumer, so it receives the union of the configuration. The producer side waypoints only receive the producer side configuration. And Z tunnel acts as the client, and we know Z tunnel's orders of magnitude cheaper.
Louis, these
So
guys
in
have tuned it. Sorry. These guys have tuned it, man. Like I know.
Oh, I'm
like,
sure. Even if you have tuned it, like we haven't published this number, right? So we should publish this number, right? Like this degenerate case.
Yeah, I
After
would be
Like I-
very interested in seeing that because I wasn't aware that a waypoint envoy should be lighter than a sidecar envoy. Is I think.
Oh
what you said.
yeah,
Oh yeah,
much
yeah.
lighter.
Yeah. Just because you're
And by non-tuned use cases, massively lighter.
yeah.
Like Neeraj is talking about even like the tuned guys like AutoTrader, where they do like use the sidecar resource and they do all the dependency pruning. Still cheaper.
Yeah, I'll be interested in that. I don't think the delta there is significant, but I might be missing
It's not.
something.
It's not significant in the degenerate case, right?
Yeah.
But the point is it worse? And the answer I think is no. Right. So they're like
Plus you only-
degenerate versus like the operational benefit, which maybe Carl cares about or he doesn't. We're not trying to like force his hand or anything. But for somebody who's looking at greenfield that has the degenerate case, there's no resource cost downside to waypoint, and the operational stuff is better. So that would be a better choice for them regardless.
Not really, actually. In the degenerate case, the operational cost for someone is a little weird because they now have to manage the life cycle of waypoints differently. Whereas for sidecars,
We get to do the rolling up. We give them tooling for the rolling upgrade waypoint instead of building the rolling update their applications.
but they will have to do the specification of at what aggregation level the waypoints come up and at least create the gateway resource replica counts themselves, right?
There's also the tune case, which I don't know how many users do this, but in Carl's particular case, auto scaling is done manually. When you auto scale an app that has a sidecar, the sidecar by definition scales up with the app to meet the demand.
That's
When
what
you separate them into 2 different scalability units, the app can scale up and it may take a while for the waypoint to match it. For instance, right now, we don't even ship an HPA for the waypoint. So the app scales up,
like
it just gets stuck.
like we have to fix that, right?
Yeah.
Like those are like these 2 things, like zone aware LB and auto scaling, are like 2 known gaps.
Okay.
Hence alpha, right?
Well, then I'll emphasize that these were learnings for me. Perhaps not
no,
learning.
these are learnings for everyone.
Well, we should actually run the test. Like I have my own understanding of what I think the resource cost profile is going to be, but we haven't actually run it. So we should run it.
Well, we did run some tests, but the scale wasn't
Not
big enough.
well, we have so I gave a talk at QCon last week, and Alex from Solo did a demo where we did, Nick Nellis has this kind of synthetic application generator, which generates like a certain number of applications and services per namespace, and then it generates a certain depth of call graph through those namespaces. So we set up 100 namespaces, 1,000 pods. We were about 10 pods per namespace with about 3 services per namespace. So something that like looks like you might see in production with a call depth and then traffic, right? And the traffic was generated to 30% CPU utilization of the cluster. And then we installed ambient L4 only in it, and then we installed ambient with waypoint in it. I can probably share the deck. I have the deck.
Yeah, would love to see the recording. Sounds like it's cool. Did you guys see the resource saving up to 90 or even more?
So with ambient L4 only, right, the only thing we saw was there was no need to increase the reservation or CPU cost in the cluster because we just caused slightly more utilization. Then obviously when waypoints went in, right, then we saw, because we talked about how you needed to size the cluster, and we needed one more node compared to the baseline which had no mesh. But it's not testing the degenerate case. Like that's what I would consider a more typical case of like a certain number of pods per namespace.
I would. I mean, again, the deployment patterns for customers vary, right? It's very hard to meet
huge
every case, right? So the case that I would say is more normal is across regions, you might have the passive clusters which are standing by in a more dormant state, and then once the traffic reaches there, whenever you fail over at fine grain or coarse grain, you do a ramp up of pods, right? So there, obviously, you will save quite a bit of resources when the ramp up is happening. Maybe at steady state, but one zone per pod, I think, yeah.
I mean, we should test it. Like, there's no reason not to test it and compare memory and CPU footprint, right? So, like for Carl, like if this is his 70% case, then at least we tell him, look, we think it's cost neutral. It has these different dynamics which you can think about, but it's at least dollar bill neutral. Because what he's caring about here, right, he's caring about money here because he's caring about zone egress costs, right? So money matters, and zone egress costs maybe matter even more than CPU and RAM.
Oh, absolutely. I think that can go out of hand very quickly.
Yes, we hear this a lot from customers. So yes, I'm keenly aware of this issue. But we should address it. Like it's obviously a question hanging out there in the ecosystem. So
yeah, I'm working a little bit getting to know the KubeCost project and talking with some members of that team to start building some tooling for Istio users to get a handle on what the cost of their sidecar is, and be able to do some hopefully useful, maybe even in-environment comparisons of what ambient might cost. But zone egress was a cost attribute that I was not really aware of. So it was an interesting thing to learn about.
Yeah, as far as I know, it is the #1 cost control factor in large-scale deployments today.
Yeah. I know we're at the top of the hour, so I'll just show I've got a brief conclusion slide. At a high level, I think I misunderstood going into the talk some of the costs of sidecar mode and some of the costs of ambient, and it was helpful to have our users speak out on that and help educate me on the economics of running Istio, which I feel like even today I've learned more on that direction, which is great. Again, I feel like Greenfield, this is a pretty obvious win. If you've not adopted a service mesh and you're interested in one, ambient is just clearly superior to sidecars in almost every way, except for maturity at the moment, but we're working on that. The legacy, I got to stop saying that. Existing sidecar users like Josh and Carl and Kyle, I think we need to consider what value we want to provide to them, what the story is, and what the implications of that are for how much we invest in compatibility and a path forward for those users.
Yeah, this is very
a good question for TOC, because this is a planning body. Which group are we trying to optimize right? We want to satisfy both sets of people, right? But we make priority decisions about like potentially like larger total addressable market, greenfield, non-existing mesh users. Are we trying to get more of them? Or are we trying to do more work to make Josh and Carl and Kyle happier? I would say right now it's the former, not the latter. But we may pivot at some point. But are we looking to pivot now?
No, I mean, this is a no-brainer, right? Like, I mean, as a business person, you got to expand your market footprint. I mean, you already have users, right? Unless there's a chance of losing them, which hopefully we never do. I think they're here with us. We won't hurt them,
Yeah.
and then hopefully we get net new, right? So, yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any change of course of action. One thing which is interesting, though, we can try, Louis and everyone else, is see if you're trying to optimize for new users. Istio has evolved with this feature set over the last 6 years. Someone coming to the Istio project probably doesn't need in the entire feature set. So we might be able to say ambient GA in a reduced capacity with the 80/20 rule, which might get us more feedback quickly, rather than to say everything that the sidecar supports has to be supported in ambient before we call it GA.
Totally, yeah.
Right? I mean,
Even so,
so
like, I think that's been the course that largely we've been on.
Yep.
Do we want to go harder at that, Keith?
that's what I'm trying to suggest. Keith, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess I think I agree halfway and disagree the other halfway. I think that at what point does TOC feel like that pursuing backwards compatibility, keeping that hedge there, will become a detriment to the optimal user experience for new contributors? I think that's a question. Like, what's the threshold from TOC's perspective? Like, when we see a certain amount of pain on the backwards compatibility side, or rather, yeah, a certain amount of pain keeping backwards compatibility, and that pain being on the new contributor side. What are we looking for on that area? Because I think from where I'm sitting, my concern is that we continue to try to have both, and we end up potentially, we're not going to lose. I don't think we're going to lose sidecars, but we end up losing the opportunity to ruthlessly optimize the new contributor experience for ambient.
You're talking
Sorry,
about
contributor.
Sorry, new user. Sorry, my brain.
Okay,
That's fine.
I was like, what are the compromise here? Okay.
Spoonerism, but yes, the new user experience. Excuse me.
Like, so hypothetical, like there are a bunch of hypothetical experiences. Like there's a hypothetical experience for ambient, which is L4 only, right? You look like a CNI and you get MTLS, right? With an upgrade path, right, to L7. And there's an entirely new set of docs, install everything. That's the hard left, if you want. It's not like there's no merit in it, right? That's the thing that would make Darren happy, and probably a bunch of other people happy. It might even make me happy. I don't know. Making a decision between those things is hard. Like what we tried to do is, like, if there's going to be something that's too hard to do, to implement, to maintain, it's going to just be too complex, then we would make a deliberate compromise on it. We would eschew backwards compatibility. And we've done that in a few places. And we may do that in a few more places. Because I think we're still thrashing through a couple of those issues. Like, there's some emergent ones. I think that's mostly been our approach, right? Is to try and make decisions based on a goal of reducing aggregate complexity. Having settled on an architecture, largely settled on an architecture, right, where there's a clear separation between the network layer and the kind of application processing layer or L7 layer. And anything that works against that, we would push back on. Anything that works towards it, we would support. even if it sometimes adds a little complexity. But there are been some emergent use cases like hairpinning, right? Alt-Z policy and workload awareness that we're still trying to work through. I think we're quite close on a lot of these things. Like if we look at ambient and where it is, right? There's some well understood major technical hurdles, but for the most part, things work. And then there's fit and polish issues, like the stuff Mitch brought up, like zone-aware load balancing, scale, cost analysis. Well, we're not at an impasse. It's taking time. Like, this is not easy.
So Louis, I don't think we will be at an impasse with the current feature set, unless architecturally it's not possible to do one thing in ambient that we're doing in sidecar. The impasse comes when we do net new things. For example, tomorrow we want to support HTTP3 mask or whatever the new hotness is natively. In API wise versus like, then we have a creation point, right? Do you want to just do it in one place or the other, which can be an inducement for people to also migrate, right? So I think until we catch up with the actual functionality that is there in sidecars, make it more or less work with ambient, and then when the new features arrive, I think we have to make a decision point not only for the developer experience of adding that new feature, we're going to do it in both cases, also the complexity, and then what's the North Star. If every user of S2 eventually moves to ambient, there's no point continuously adding all the new functionality in sidecar models. Right? I just don't know how many of these things exist right now, the net new feature that we're going to add, right?
Well, I mean, the other, like, one of the big parts of ambient, right? Sidecars forced us to put all the functionality into one thing, which meant we couldn't layer, which meant there was no optionality of any kind, right? You couldn't separate the L4 layer from the L7 layer. Just it was impossible. Which created a ton of feature pressure, right? Because the only way to get something into that ecosystem was to add it, for us to add it. By layering, we have less of that pressure, right? Like, we're trying to enable some optionality in the layers. We're not all the way there yet, but we're like, that's a clear architectural goal.
I agree.
And so that should lessen, like, at some point we could say, look, these are the only features that Istio is going to have, and then the only people that we listen to when we get asked for those features are users who, like, if there's enough of them, will support the feature, and if not, like, maybe there's some ecosystem option available for them that offers them what they want, or some ability for them to do their own integration. Like, there's nothing really saying that you can't take your own, like, if we fix the sandwich and those types of things, that you could have your own statically configured hand-tuned envoy be a waypoint. Like, good luck doing that with sidecars. I mean, good grief. But with sandwich and the waypoint, you might actually be able to do that.
That's fair.
Or use something else.
Yeah. I mean, as long as the separation exists, right, and ztunnel is there, even in waypoints, you might be able to terminate all your transport concerns there.
Right. I mean, that's definitely the goal, right? Like, to have layering. Like, that's the value of having layering. If we can do that, that gives us a lot of flexibility and users in time. But it's too easy to kind of project that onto users. We have to, like, you have to be a reference implementation. You have to show yourself working end to end.
I know we are over. I would still say, do we want to look at the feature set that you want to say in ambient that makes it a GA product? I just don't know if we have. I know we are trying to get to beta next, which is fine, but I think beta and GA can be a long distance if you have to support everything sidecar does.
Well, I'll say for one part, I've been holding up beta very particularly on the issue of user feedback. If we reimagine, well, maybe it's not we, if I start beginning to think of this as a product that primarily applies to greenfield users, user feedback is still needed, but the way that we go about getting it is different. and perhaps the amount of user feedback, the depth of user feedback can be different from what we would expect if this was just a new evolution of the existing Istio project.
That's a very good point, actually.
I agree.
I mean, like either way, we need somebody, right, to try in something approximating their production environment. I mean, you might argue that Istio went 1.0 before anybody was really in production with it, but I guess people were, despite the hard at the time, or the instability. But yeah, we should take a hard look at it. I think we always assumed we would get more likely to get feedback from user doing an upgrade, right? Getting into production via an upgrade because they were already using the APIs. If that's not the case, then yes.
Yeah, I think it's clearly not the case this time. We're getting new user from Sidecar to Ambient. It's going to be net new user. So to Neeraj and Keith's point, I think we should go back to our beta documents and also think about GA. I really think we're probably planning too many Cs in that document right now. Maybe the initial production ready should just be layer 4 functionality in Ambient, just having something going, right? So people can try this on different stage and different requirements.
I mean, as long as the expectations and communication is clear, I don't think there'll be a blowback here. The issue with Istio historically has been we have not been very clear on communication and setting expectations sometimes.
Yeah.
What are we replicating? How is the next release coming with what feature set? So I think a limited release with things actually being solid and working and saying, you know what, if you have a use case or a new user who just wants MTLS easily in your environment, make sure this is production ready. I think people will buy that.
That sounds like an
Right.
So we
agenda topic for Wednesday.
Yes.
Yes, yes, let's
Yes.
do that.
I'll drop. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Neeraj.
Yeah, thank you, Mitch, for collecting all the feedback. Appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. I've been told that we should maybe consider doing this periodically, once a month, once a quarter, something along those lines. I'll probably reach out to other TOC members about joining it because I find that the like host and expert model works well because there is a lot of dead air at the beginning before users begin engaging in the topic. But hopefully I know it was valuable for me. Hopefully it was valuable for you all as well.
Yeah, getting people talking is always valuable. Always valuable. And yes, feedback to steering. I'm not currently on steering. Think about 2 different marketing strategies, right? Greenfield and existing, and let's have a plan. We should have a plan for both.
Yeah, I will make sure that feedback is conveyed to steering on Thursday this week. All right, thanks everybody. See you guys soon.